Good afternoon. Good. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Actually, I think 4:05. So it's good to get the juices flowing again. Thank you for coming here. You're in for a treat today. I hope you've got the book, or you'll get it on the way out. Jason DeParle's book, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, One Family in Migration in the 21st Century. And we have Dilip Ratha with us as well. Great to have both of you here. A lot of my colleagues at MPI have spent a lot of time with Jason as he's been writing this book. And we're very honored to see such a wonderful product come out and have a chance to host you for a book talk. And Dilip is also very much part of this book as well, actually. So, and good to have you back at MPI.
Thank you.
To be here. This book is a treat to read. It reads like a novel, first of all, let me say. I mean, it really reads like a novel. It's a story of a family, but it's also a story of migration around the world. And Jason very subtly drops in statistics, information, debates, analysis within the overall flow of the narrative. So read it not as that nonfiction book that you feel you need to read to keep your mind flowing, but as the next novel you want to read, but know that you will learn a lot in the process as well. It is also the exact opposite as we head into campaign season. It is the exact opposite of the conversations we usually have on immigration or on migration around the world, which usually fit nicely on bumper stickers. It is filled with nuance. It's filled with the contradictions of migration for those who migrate, for those who are left behind, for communities where migrants go. It assumes, we'll come back to this when we get to Q&A, and I'm sure Jason and Dilip will each talk about this in different ways. It is a book that is not meant to be pushing a point of any sort, that talks about migration very much as a natural phenomenon that has gone on throughout history, but it tries to understand the nuances and the contradictions that are laden within migration, and really when it comes down to people's lives, right? The difficult choices that people make in the process. So I'm supposed to introduce you guys. So Jason DeParle is a reporter from the New York Times. He's written extensively about poverty and immigration. His book, American Dream, 3 Women, 10 Kids, and A Nation's Drive to End Welfare was the New York Times notable book, was a New York Times notable, and won the Helen Burstein Award from the New York City Library. He's been an Emerson Fellow at New America and is a recipient of the George Polk Award and is a 2-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Thought I'd drop that in too. Dilip Ratha is head of Nomad, I think doesn't probably need an introduction in this group, but is head of Nomad and lead economist, migration remittances at the World Bank. He's also the subject of a great New York Times story written by Jason about his story and how it ties into the work he does at the World Bank. Mr. Ratha is currently working to lower remittance fees and provide innovative financing solutions for people, businesses, and governments. And he's worked extensively on migration, innovative financing for development, including remittances, diaspora bonds, future flow securitization, and prediction of sovereign credit ratings. You have to check out his TED Talk, which has been seen 1.3 million times on the hidden force in global economics, sending money home. He's the founder of Nomad, co-founder of Migrating Out of Poverty Research Consortium, and conceived of the Africa Institute for Remittances. And he really was, I think it's fair to say, the person who quantified remittances in the way that really began to get people's attention, why this is a phenomenon that matters so much for the world. So great to have both of you here. You are at Migration Policy Institute. If you were planning to be at something else, this is your chance. This is like you're on the flight to Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're going anywhere else, you can get off the airplane. Welcome here. You can follow us. Thank you for those of you on the webcast. You can tweet about this event. You can, when we get to it, you can tweet questions to us at Migration Policy. You can use the hashtag MPI Discuss as we are, if you want to tweet about the event. You can email events@migrationpolicy.org. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn over to Jason and ask you to say a little bit about the book. Tell us about what the book's about. And then Dilip will offer a few comments, and we'll go into a bit of a discussion.
Thank you. Andrew, I feel like I'm having a homecoming of sorts. There's no institution I've relied on more than MPI. For my research, as poor Michelle Middlestack, their patient communications director can attest, and a few people I've learned more from than Dilip, who actually took me all the way home to Sindekala, India, for a taste of his sister's chapatis. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter living in Manila with an interest in shanty towns, the scrapwood mazes that cover the city and much of the developing world. I called the city's most famous nun, who lived and worked in a shanty town called Levarisa. I didn't tell her, but I was hoping I could move in. Sister Christine Tam was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and busy on a commission drafting a new constitution. Call me back in a few months, she snapped. Hoping for a quicker audience, I told her I'd been working with another nun in her order, but apparently they weren't friends. That's a mistake, she said. Meet me tomorrow morning in front of the Manila Zoo. Are you CIA, she asked when I arrived. Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you? She let me know that living in Levarisa, living with a Levarisa family wouldn't work. She said, the poor are magnificent people, unlike the rich, but Americans need toilets and most homes in Levarisa lack them. A family would feel obligated to buy me expensive food. I'd be a burden. Then she talked on and denounced American military bases and American corporations, waved a hand above her head and said, well, that's all up here, meaning politics. Somehow we need to build better links between the first and the third worlds. If I returned in a few days, she'd see what she could do. So I returned in a few days, thinking she would have used that time to approach a family. And instead, she led me into the alleys and auctioned me off on the spot. I knew just enough Tagalog to know the first woman she asked was horrified, and so was the second, and the third was simply struck mute. At which point, Sister Christine just stalked off. If you don't want him, pass him on to somebody else. Don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad. And I was standing there with this, I don't know who was more frightened, the woman, Tita, Comodas, or me. We attracted a crowd. Ask him if he eats rice, a neighbor said. Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina. Tita stalled for as long as she could, then gave in to what she thought to be Sister Christine's request and offered me a spot on her floor. I was interested in slum life, not migration, but migration was how the family survived. Tita's husband, Emmet, was 5,000 miles away, cleaning pools in Saudi Arabia, while Tita was home raising their 5 kids on the money he sent. All 5 of those kids grew up to become overseas workers too, and they're part of a large extended family spread out across the globe. The child I came to know best was Tita's daughter, Rosalie. She used her father's remittances to make the leap from the slums to nursing school and spent nearly 2 decades working in the Persian Gulf, all the while hoping to get to the States. Then a hurricane hit Galveston, Texas, with Katrina-like consequences. Unable to lure enough nurses back to the struggling island, the local hospital finally recruited abroad, hiring 20 foreign nurses to open a new ward, and Rosalie had her chance. She arrived in the summer of 2012 with her husband and 3 young children soon following. I spent years tagging along after them. Their period of adjustment coincided with the rise of Donald Trump and a surge of conservative populism that regards immigration as a threat. The experience of Rosalie and her family offers a retort. With a house in the suburbs and kids on the honor roll, they achieved in 3 years a degree of assimilation that used to take 3 generations. And they did so, moreover, in Metro Houston, a hub of pro-immigrant diversity deep in red state America, which is a hint, perhaps, that immigration is less divisive in daily life than it is in politics. In a country of 44 million immigrants, no family stands for the whole. Rosalie's experience merely stands for the part missing from the president's Twitter feed. It's also the greatest anti-poverty success story I know. It began in the early 1950s when a little boy on a distant island was smuggled aboard a crowded ferry for an overnight trip to Manila. That was Rosalie's father, Emmet. He was recently orphaned, and a distant relative visiting the province had agreed to take him home. Home was Levarisa, a squalid mudflat ruled by warring gangs where sanitation consisted of flying saucers, bundles of waste wrapped in newspapers and flung into the surrounding canals. Emmet liked the tumult of city life. He wore his geniality as a shield and was quick to make friends. Drawn to commerce more than to school, he spent his youth in traffic, hawking newspapers and cigarettes. In his early 20s, he landed his first real job, cleaning a government pool. He was walking home soon after when he spied the most beautiful woman he had ever met in the alley, ironing clothes. That was Tita. She considered him poor-looking and plain-looking and poorer than a rat, but Emmet's persistence carried the day. They married in 1967, and 5 children followed alliteratively: Rolando, Rowena, Rosalie, Roldan, and Rosalier. Rowena, Rosalie's older sister, was born with a heart defect that left her perpetually weak and in need of medicine that Emmet couldn't afford. After years of fretting over her failed health, Emmet dropped to his knees and asked God to make a decision. Take her or let him have her. God answered in a mysterious way. Soon after, Emmet got an offer to work in Saudi Arabia. He'd be away for 2 years in a country where stories of abused workers are rife, but he'd earn 10 times his Manila pay. He accepted on the spot. By the time I arrived, 7 years later, Emmet was on his third contract. Rowena had medicine, and the house was one of the few in Levarisa with a toilet. I had found my place among the poor, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with them, and they weren't quite sure what to do with me. Language gaps and excessive politeness kept Tita and me strangers for a few days. Then she enlisted my help with a glue pot project, turning newspapers into paper bags. I botched the job so badly she laughed and threatened to mark them "Made in USA." My incompetence put her at ease. Half of Tita's life revolved around drudgery. I'd be on my floor mat before dawn, hearing her boil the breakfast rice. I'd be back there at midnight listening to her wrestle the laundry. But the other half revolved around Slum Solidarity as a member of Sister Christine's Uplift Group, a program of Bible studies and livelihood projects meant to answer the question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were a squatter? As the manager of the co-op store, Tita was responsible for distributing 2,000 eggs a week, which she stacked under a fluorescent light in the kitchen to keep away the rats. Between chores, Tita told me she'd been asking God a question. Why, if you love your son, are so many Filipinos poor? It's the central question of faith. Why does an omnipotent God allow suffering? And one with special meaning in a place as poor as Levarisa. Also not one I expected a woman with a 6th grade education to ask. I asked her what God had answered. Not yet, she laughed, as if mocking her own spiritual quest. I'm not sure what I expected to find in the Manila slums, but it wasn't a woman in a worn housecoat trying to live out the gospel beneath a tower of eggs. Rosalie was Tita's main helper, a shy, dutiful girl, always cast as a nun in the school youth plays. If you were going to pick the girl with a drive to escape Levarisa, you wouldn't have picked Rosalie. There were others who were more outgoing or showed more academic promise. But the most telling line on her high school transcript wasn't her grades. In 4 years, she never missed a single day. About high school is where I got grit, she said. The surest way for a Filipino woman to advance was to become a nurse. The U.S. had established the country's first nursing schools during the colonial occupation, seeding what became a well-established migratory path to the U.S. Nursing school was a leap for a girl from the slums, but Rosalie made it. Then an uncle returned from Saudi Arabia and said a hospital near Mecca was hiring. On her second contract in Saudi, Rosalie met her husband, Chris, a Filipino working in a Jeddah factory. They courted secretly to avoid the religious police and married in the Philippines. Family logistics got complicated. A daughter followed, then she got a job in Abu Dhabi, then another daughter, then a son. Rosalie and Chris worked in Abu Dhabi. The kids mostly lived in the Philippines with Tita and Emmet on a farm. It was supposed to be a short-term arrangement until Rosalie got a job in the States, but it lasted 8 years. Rosalie and I kept in touch, but we didn't see each other for 2 decades after I left the Philippines. Then I went back to write a story about her for the New York Times Magazine. The light bulb moment for me in understanding the importance of migration was learning from Dilip that the remittances, the sums that immigrants send home, are more than 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. Migration is the world's largest anti-poverty program. No country does more to promote migration than the Philippines, where the government trains and markets overseas workers and presidents celebrate them as heroes. The paper sent me back to explore migration's effect on Philippine culture, and I briefly worried that the story might be too subtle for an outsider to grasp. And then I drove by the Philippine Central Bank, where the year's remittance tally was strung up in Christmas lights. There are quarter billion immigrants scattered across the globe, but what characterizes modern migration isn't just its size, but its ubiquity. Ireland has its first African-born mayor. Mongolians do scut work in Prague. Every country's story differs, but the underlying forces are generally the same. Rich, aging countries need workers. Workers in poor countries need jobs. Cheap travel speeds the way, and instant communication spreads word that opportunity awaits. Excited by all I was learning, I decided to expand the story into a book built around Rosalie and her family. But there was one problem. A narrative about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi wouldn't speak directly to migration in the U.S. Then a month after I agreed to do the project, The narrative gods smiled. Rosalie got a job in Texas. I met her in Manila and we traveled to Galveston, where things got off to a rocky start. She came expecting Disney World and wound up in a declining blue-collar town with a vista of vacant lots. The cost of living was higher than she expected. American English was hard to understand. Someone suggested we grab lunch at a little hole in the wall. She took me aside and looked alarmed. Hole in the wall? The hole in the wall served poor boys. Why not poor girls, she asked. World travelers aren't always worldly. Rosalie had long worked abroad, but always in a cocoon of Filipinos. Homesick, she retreated into the familiar. There are 7,600 islands in the Philippines. Her apartment became the 7,601st, with purple yam in the refrigerator and Tagalog soaps on the TV. The first place that Rosalie felt comfortable was the hospital, not because the work was easy, but because she felt equal to its difficulties. Work for her became a vehicle of assimilation. One thing to note about Rosalie's work is that she didn't take an American job. She filled a job that the hospital had been trying for years to fill, and in doing so helped Galveston improve its medical care. Another thing to note is that Rosalie's a really good nurse. The hospital gave me a pair of scrubs and permission to follow her as much as I wanted. But the most telling testimonial occurred in the Walmart produce aisle. She was grocery shopping one day when a former patient rushed up and grabbed her and said, "Remember me?" Rosalie looked blank. It was clear she didn't. And the woman said, "GI bleed, bad GI bleed." Rosalie said, "Room 13. It had been 6 months. The woman had no idea who I was, of course, but she turned to me and she just gushed. You can tell she just really loves to take care of people. It wasn't like, this is just my job. And I heard that all the time. One patient told me that when she woke up from surgery, the first thing she saw was Rosalie's face. I just remember thinking she has the kindest eyes, the woman said. Another said, it's like she feels your pain. One night, a delusional man tried to climb out of bed, tangled up in wires and protective boots. It took 5 nurses to restrain him. One complained she'd hurt his hand. Another asked if I understood now how hard nurses had to work. Another said, just leave him. It was Rosalie who called the resident, woke her up in the middle of the night, and insisted she come change the patient's medication, which quieted him for the night. Given all the political talk of immigrants taking jobs, I wondered if her patients harbored any resentments. I made a point of asking in private. Not one did. They noticed her care, not her ethnicity. If anyone might resent her, I thought it might be the elderly African-American I met one night who told me she had wanted to be a nurse herself but never gotten beyond minimum wage work as a nursing aide. How did she feel about a foreigner taking a nursing job, I asked. Though she was black and Rosalie was Filipino, she said she considered them part of the same clan, the tribe of low-born strivers. I admire anybody and everybody that tries to get up a little higher, she said. 6 months after Rosalie arrived, the family followed. Christine was 9, Lara was 7, Dominique, the boy, was 5. After years apart, they weren't just learning to live together in a new country, they were learning to live together, period. The kids assimilated rapidly, but in surprising and contrasting ways. Christine, the eldest, assimilated to the popularity-seeking ways of middle school girls, snapping selfies by the thousands and posting them on Instagram accounts with names like Christine Cute. She's Americanizing, her teacher groaned. Lara had a special gift for blending her Filipino and American selves. I can trace the arc of Lara's assimilation through a story about Rosa Parks. When Lara first arrived in 2nd grade, her teacher told her that Parks was a hero. But a hero in handcuffs made no sense to a girl from the Philippines, where children are admonished to respect their elders and obey authority. She didn't listen to the policeman, Lara said. She couldn't be a hero. And besides, heroes wear capes. A year later, Lara announced over dinner one night, apropos of nothing, I sort of agree with Rosa Parks. She had paid her money like everybody else, and it wasn't fair for her to sit in the back of the bus. But what Lara admired wasn't just Parks's principles, but also her politeness. When the policeman arrested her, she didn't say any bad words. For an immigrant deftly blending cultures, Parks became the civil rights hero who didn't curse. The point goes beyond Lara. Sociologist Phil Kasnitz studied 3,400 kids in New York City and found that the children of immigrants on average outperformed the children of the native born, and did so despite having parents with less education and money. How could that be? He argued that children of immigrants often enjoy a second-generation advantage. 2 parts of their theory are familiar. One is that immigrants, self-selected for ambition, pass along their drive. Another is that the density of ethnic networks offers an advantage that natives lack. But Kasnitz cited a third factor, that immigrants benefit intellectually from living at a cultural crossroads. They combine the best of both worlds, their parents and their peers. Lara was second-generation advantage personified. Her Philippine traits included her manners, her faith, and her close family bonds. From the U.S., she got a reduced sense of class and gender constraints and a license to ask questions. Nothing in Philippine life had encouraged her to probe. On the contrary, Filipino children are taught to obey their elders, not interrogate them, and a classroom of 70 kids had little time for raised hands. But American teachers loved questions. Do fish sleep? Lara asked. Is the Leaning Tower of Pisa going to fall? Do nurses have to be caring? Maybe I'll just be a doctor. Curious how she'd grown curious, Lara formed her own assimilation theory. She said she was new to the country and afraid of having to repeat second grade, so I told myself I better be interested right now. Being interested became a habit. Put differently, life at her cultural crossroads had encouraged new ways of thinking, just as Kasnitz had said. One of my favorite story about Lara. One day we stopped for an after-school snack, and she sprang a sneaky question. Do you know how to infer? I frowned as if trying to remember. I'm going to teach you, she said. She paused to dip her French fry in her McFlurry and increased the surprise. It's like when you say, oh, it's cold outside, it's really snowy. I didn't tell you what season it was, but you can infer it's winter. And she stabbed the air with her milky fry and said, you see, it works. After 2 years in the States, the foreign nurses finished their contracts and got hired as permanent staff. Pay raises and permanent status ignited a real estate boom. 6 of them bought houses in the same subdivision, and 3, including Rosalies, shared a cul-de-sac. After just 3 years, that badge of American belonging, a house in the suburbs, was hers. A month later, Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign with an attack on immigrants, whom he called criminals, terrorists, welfare cheats, a threat to jobs, wages, housing, schools, tax bills, and general living conditions. He offered crowds a parable about immigrant treachery he called the snake. Rosalie wasn't a snake, she was a nurse. In standard cost-benefit terms, her move was a triple win. Good for her patients, good for the family she supports back in the Philippines. But cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do her story justice. Rosalie's escape from Levarisa was a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life fuller, deeper, and more filled with hope. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place where people go to make dreams come true. I asked Rosalie how the new house compared with the hovel where we'd first met, with the leaks, the heat, the rats, the crowds, and the stench. Oh my God, she told the kids, big difference. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine's response was a measure of Rosalie's success. What's a shanty, Mommy? She asked.
Now you see why you should read this book, right? That was a tour de force of 320 pages. Pieces of it. Dilip, tell us about the book. Tell us your thoughts.
Thank you, Andrew. I read almost 99% of the book. There were a couple places I couldn't, I skipped over because I didn't have time. But I cried a few times. And in the end, it was difficult, and I might cry. I hope not. But that's the story. I was wondering how Jason is going to summarize all that he has written. And what he cleverly left out is the scholarly exploration, the data, the wealth of information, literature survey, the controversies that he puts out. So I found the book, it's an epic, it's honest, intelligent, informative, and sympathetic chronicle of migration and global development, not development alone, global development. Actually, it is 2 books in one. First, a scholarly chronicle with a wealth of data, information, research, and second, an epic biography of a large family, complete with drama, nuances, and humor that reads like a fast-paced novel. As far as I know, this is the first of its kind in the migration literature, a book written both for migration scholars and policymakers who may benefit from the nuanced case study, and other readers who may be interested in the migration story but may be surprised by the facts behind the stories, facts that may not fit the ubiquitous current narrative. The book shows that migration benefits the destination countries, most notably by providing skills that may be missing, by providing workers for jobs that the native-born people may not want to perform. Talk about Chris, talk about Rosalie in the book. Migrants pay taxes, they're less prone to commit crimes than native-born people, and they learn English, as in the case of the US migration, at a fast pace, much faster than people think they do. It benefits the migrants and the family, very likely enabling an extended household to break the cycle of poverty. For women, migration empowers them. For children, it provides education opportunities. And for the family back home and the country of origin, migration provides enormous remittances. Jason calls it a lightbulb moment, recalling when he first became...
Or the switch, right?
Recalling when he first became aware of the size of these flows. At that time, remittances were 3 times the total of development aid. This year, 2019, remittances are on track to overtake foreign direct investment flows to low and middle income countries. And in 5 years' time, remittances are on track to overtake both foreign direct investment and development aid together. Yet, there are challenges associated with migration. In destination countries, the challenge could be job competition faced by native-born workers or older migrants. Yet, for a large number of semi-skilled jobs or skilled jobs, and in many dirty and dangerous jobs, the native-born workers are simply not interested. The real worry in destination countries is not so much about job competition for native-born workers. Actually, it is about national and cultural identity. The race is one factor. Language, in the case of US, English language is another. And the book goes deep into discussion of assimilation and integration issues. It has poignant anecdotes involving Rosalie, Chris, the children trying to catch up with American English. You heard a couple of them already. There is one where a patient at 1:30 in the morning shouts for chicken, and Rosalie, the nurse, asks if he wants children. Or the way Chris, the husband, and his colleagues address each other. I won't say how they do that. Please read the book. I shouldn't say it. One of them calls Chris Filipino. The other one calls something else, politically not correct. In the end, the book shows how migrants end up as Americans, traveling not a straight line integration process, but a bumpy path. Migrants bring challenges to the family left behind as well. The most important challenge is emotional cost. And I have not seen a story that elucidates emotional cost in as much depth and nuance as this book. And that single factor is missing from the literature, especially the more dominant literature from the economics side of the economics of migration. The emotional cost is missing. And that is one of the reasons why you have so much controversy about migration policy and policy reversals relating to the benefits of migration. Migration can split families. It can split husband from wife, parents from children. It can be heartbreaking. It can bring intractable dilemmas in bringing up children, as when Rosalie's children join her in Galveston, and she fears that they would become Americans and they would lose Filipino values. Yet the book points out that migration is not all about money or profession. It is also about one's calling. I'm surprised you left that. in the case of Rosalie, the protagonist of the book, it is mostly the calling, the desire to help others as a nurse. I'm going to read a passage that I think is probably the most important, most, to me, symptomatic of this whole phenomenon. It was almost 6:30. The day nurses filed in, Rosalie hugged the engineer's wife and gave the delusional kidney patient his meds with no talk of chicken. Remember, this was the same patient. She went out into the sun-scrubbed morning with a satisfied yawn. Celtic pilgrims search for thin places. Celtic pilgrims search for thin places where the distance between heaven and earth narrows and the presence of God is more readily felt. Rosalie, the almost nun, worked in a thin place. I found this profoundly appropriate for the story of migration. Now, I do want to, since I'm in Migration Policy Institute as opposed to Politics and Prose, where you would hear more about this story on Friday, I'm going to point out certain things that are so important for policy making, will be so important for policy making going forward. We already know that there are about 266 million international migrants in the world. The income gap between rich and poor countries is 1 to 54 right now. High income countries have a per capita income on average of 43,000. Poor countries have a per capita income of under $800 only. That gap of 1 to 54 or 54 to 1, it will take 135 years to bridge, if at all. Low and middle income countries are going to add 552 million working age population by 2030 compared to now. 552 million working age population. Not all of them will get jobs in those low and middle income countries. The current stock of international migrants is 266 million. It's going to surge. Migration is going to increase. On top of that, you have climate change, which might displace another 140, 150 million people. In other words, migration is inevitably going to increase. Up to a point, we need efforts to enable a good provider not to have to leave. Beyond that point, it would be necessary that a good provider can leave, is not stopped from leaving. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. We're going to go into a question and answer period. Let me ask each of you a few questions here, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Again, you can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy, use the hashtag MPI Discuss, or send us an email to events@migrationpolicy.org. If you're out there, if you're in the room, you can just raise your hand when we get to that. You know, the old method works the best. But let me, when I was reading this, I couldn't help thinking of my own mother, who was a nurse from Denmark, actually, and her own sort of conflicts about living in the United States and having made the choice to come to the United States and raising kids in the United States. And her pathway was comparatively easy compared to what Rosalie goes through here. Talk to us a little bit about the contradictions, about, if Rosalie were to sit down and draw a list of good things and bad things. I think it was one of her friends did that at one point her cousin did that at one point. Rosalie was not into doing it, but if she would do that, what would be the things that she would say it was worth it and the things she would say it wasn't worth it?
Well, yeah, Rosalie was terribly, I think she had a dilemma familiar to most, or at least many immigrant parents, which is she wanted her kids to Americanize, and she was afraid of Americanization. So one of the girls got invited for a sleepover, and that went over in the Philippine household like you would have you're running off and joining the circus or something. Or I've never seen Chris get so worked up he thundered. No, never, not, no. Unless it was a Filipino family, then it was okay. She was adamant that they retain Tagalog, and they immediately forgot it. I think what she would, if she was to make a ledger, she would want them to retain Tagalog, which they didn't, Jesus, which they did, and a devotion to their family, which they did. What she was suspicious of, I think, was American independence. She came and stayed with me on the way to Texas in suburban Washington for a couple days. She was very disturbed at how quiet it was. She said people have to make appointments before they go to each other's houses. She didn't like that. She learned that Americans send their children away at age 18. She thought that was, she was aghast at that. They go off to college. She didn't want her children to become free thinkers the way Americans are encouraged. Lara had a great exercise once in fourth grade where you had to, they had to take a vote in the classroom. Should you keep secrets from your parents? And you know, she was too Filipino to want to say yes, and she had to kind of figure out a way to blend that in her usual way of American and Filipino traits. She decided you shouldn't keep secrets because your parents will find out anyways, and it's just more efficient if you tell them. So this combined Filipino obedience and American old-fashioned deficiency. And so as usual, she found a hybrid blend.
She spent a long time away from her kids, right? I mean, there were long periods of time, and this is true. You chronicle a number of other people in addition to Rosalie's story. You know, this is true of many of the Filipino workers who go abroad, and it's true of many migrants who go abroad, trying to better their situations.
It was particularly complicated in Rosalie's situation because her oldest daughter was largely raised by Rosalie's sister, Rowena, so her aunt. She called her aunt Mama. She called Rosalie Mommy. And when she moved to the U.S., she was leaving Mama for Mommy. And the aunt in the Philippines felt bereft at being left behind and would call and complain that she wasn't paying enough attention to her and she needed money. And when Christine bought a doll, her mama in the Philippines complained she should have sent her the money instead. And Rosalie felt in a competition with her sister Rowena. It was really complicated.
The Philippines government has actually invested probably more than any other government in encouraging its citizens to take jobs abroad. And you chronicle how, you know, different administrations in the Philippines try and pull back from this, right? Successive administrations come in and say, we're not going to send people abroad anymore, and end up realizing that there's no way of pulling back from this. Is this a successful development strategy? And Dilip, I want to bring you in on this as well. I mean, is this a successful development strategy? Is it better if it happens organically? You know, what did you learn from this?
The Philippine papers are filled with stories about migration. Half of them sound like get-rich schemes, you know, buy condos, use remittances for this or that. The other half sound like human rights complaints, you know, slept with the dogs, was raped in Saudi Arabia. And I think Filipinos hold those two ideas in mind simultaneously. When they go abroad, they don't say, I'm going off to make my fortune. They say, I'm going to try my luck.
Mm. And so there's always that sense it can
always
go either way
a sense,
for you.
yes, that could go either way.
What's your thoughts on countries, you know, having a policy of people going abroad? One thing is to allow people to go abroad, as you said. Another thing is to have a policy, as the Philippines has had in the past.
Well, you know, we tend to forget that when we have, we tend to forget the difference between, let's say, goods and maybe services versus people. People are, you know, you can't just ship them out. I mean, you know, that would be slavery. We are in the 21st century, I think. Am I? Or are we?
Depends where you are. Yeah.
So, you know, we give too much credit to government's abilities to manage migration and migration of people. Yes. So in the end, it has to be incentive compatible. And, you know, a policy where you don't stop the flow of people if it happens to be voluntary, and it ought to be both ways, in the destination countries as well as in the sending countries. Then it is actually beneficial for everyone, the triple win that Jason mentioned, to the migrants, to the countries of origin, to the countries of destination. And actually, a lot of people, if they happen to be in a foreign country and they are not received well, let's say they are called illegal, they are tormented, they are subject to xenophobic attacks, they actually go back because people do want to hold their heads high. So if on the other side, if you leave people in the forest, let's say, or in a place where they don't know anything and they will find a way to survive. So that's the distinction between people and goods. So what I am saying in the end is migration, when it is voluntary and these policies are supportive, can be hugely beneficial to global development.
And it's interesting. I mean, one of my close ties is to Mexico for both personal and professional reasons. And I mean, you do see countries like Mexico and many others after a period, and many countries we consider developed today, right? I mean, Italy comes to mind, countries that were at one point, heavily dependent on remittances, that over time achieve a certain degree of development, not only because of that. I mean, I think we probably wouldn't find a case where remittances are the only factor, but they become part of that factor. Yeah, and they become, and you've written about this, they're often a more pro-poor factor than other forms of aid as well.
Exactly.
You've written about this as well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And just to make the point that the numbers that I mentioned, 552 million people joining the working age population, and a bunch of them, talking about hundreds of millions of them, will not find jobs in their country. Mm-hmm. The numbers about climate change, climate displaced people, displacement due to climate change. And I haven't even mentioned yet the internal migration phenomenon. There are estimates that 760 million people are displaced or have migrated within their own country. 760 million. So together with 266 million international migrants, that's 1 billion people. They send a lot of money home. There are trade connections, investment connections, cultural ties, skill transfers, technology transfers, values transfers. Migrant women getting closer to gender equality, or having more, or being respected in the family. That is part of migration. Child mortality going down by 15 times, meaning that it goes down to 1/16 of the home country. That's migration. Yeah. So
you write a good bit about the fact that the migration from the Philippines depends a great deal on women, actually, and that it changes gender roles in important ways,
yeah, so
including in this family.
The first generation, when Emmet, Rosalie's father, went abroad, it was mostly the men who went, and in part because the jobs were predominantly male. They were construction jobs. The Saudis were full of petrodollars, and they were building roads and hospitals and airports and schools. And once they got them up, then they needed nurses to run the hospitals, and they needed people in retail and house cleaners. So across the globe, migration feminized because work feminized. People needed caregivers and nannies, and 3/4 of the new migrants going abroad in the Philippines are women.
Let me
profound
changes.
Consequences for their kids. Yeah, the kids they generally leave behind.
Yeah, and people going to be caregivers and leaving children behind.
Going to be caregiver, taking care of somebody else's kids, leaving your own kids behind, and then technology rises and Facebook becomes the connection. They stay in touch.
And parenting through social media, yes.
Yeah, so one of Rosalie's cut. So that was hard for Rosalie because her kids were too young really to do that. But her cousin, who was the nanny, had in Abu Dhabi had older kids, and they stayed in constant touch by Facebook chats. So Tess could know every day what her daughter was having for breakfast. Yeah,
the best paid nanny in Abu Dhabi. Actually, you have to read the book to actually know what I'm talking about there. Let me read one more thing out of here, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions that you have, comments that you have here in the audience, as well as those on the webcast. I believe it's the epilogue here, the last chapter, you say something that shouldn't be controversial, but it is controversial, so I'm going to read it to you. Immigration is generally good for America, but that doesn't mean it's good at every level and in all varieties. America's absorptive capacity is great, but not unlimited, and not every immigrant is as easily absorbed as Rosalie. There's a place for principled compromise. Legal status for dreamers is crucial. The diversity lottery is not. The freedom of immigration as a civil rights issue has been great helping has been a great help in promoting assimilation, but it's a problem if it encourages liberals to see every immigration issue as a matter of racial justice. There's no magic number of immigrants, just as there is no perfect mix of high-skilled, low-skilled relatives and refugees. What is essential is that America welcome those who are here and remain receptive to the gifts others can bring, whether they come with distinguished degrees or calloused hands.
I agree with that.
Yes? Well, I think you wrote it, actually. Yeah. Is this a controversial statement today? I mean, you know, every debate on immigration in this city comes down to a knife fight, right? I mean, you know, there is, you know, trying to lower immigration numbers, that's, you know, you're anti-immigrant. You think that it's important to include low-skilled workers. Somehow, you know, that's doing damage to the American economy. You're laying out a very pragmatic idea here on what immigration debates should look like, with a great deal of respect for those involved in it.
I think it is becoming more, I think the left is moving left. I don't think there's much doubt about that. If anybody watched the presidential debates, yes, I think it's in part a reaction to Donald Trump. One extreme prompts a reaction to another extreme. In a larger sense, I think it's a result of the framing of immigration. It's been good for immigration that that America's return to mass migration occurred in the context of the post-civil rights, of the civil rights movement,
Yes.
and played out in the post-civil rights era, where America was much more attuned to racial inclusion. That's generally been a good thing for assimilation. It can be a bad thing if you take every immigration question and turn it into a matter of high principle of racial justice, which every immigration issue is not. So I think that can be problematic.
Yeah. It's interesting, by the way, this book focuses on a Filipina nurse. This is not an asylum seeker from Honduras. This is a different, often we talk about immigration, often even in this room, if you turn on NPR, where I think you are probably speaking at the moment, all things considered, our image, when we say immigration, it's actually code word for talking about unauthorized immigration or asylum seekers, because our debate has sort of boiled down to that. But in fact, almost half of immigrants have some sort of college degree, right? Have a degree in something, as you note
we
here.
ran a piece about
Yes.
the family in the New York Times. Hundreds of comments poured in about a family of legal immigrants. Hundreds of comments poured in and said, "What part of illegal don't you understand?" So I think there is a dynamic in the debate where immigrant triggers the word illegal.
Yeah.
So I thought it was pretty clear that this was a story about a family of legal immigrants.
Yeah, legal professional immigrants, right? And mixed, because the husband is an engineer, but never manages to work as an engineer, right? I mean, he's always working blue-collar jobs. She is a nurse and always manages to work as a nurse, but actually come through legal channels, are both professionals. And in many ways, and look, I'm in no way suggesting that the debate on unauthorized immigration, certainly debates on asylum, are not important, because they're things we care greatly about here. But it's interesting that in many ways this narrative is probably closer to much of what immigration looks like today in the United States.
Well,
the
numerically,
debates that we constantly are pulled into. Yes.
3/4 of people who are here illegally are here legally. Yeah. So numerically, that is true. Whether I agree with you. Obviously, the situation at the border is extremely important, deserves the coverage it's getting. But I think it's come to obscure the larger and skew our perception of the larger phenomenon of immigration.
Dilip, any final words before we go to the audience here?
A couple of things. One, just to point out about the asylum seekers and refugees. We don't really put things in perspective when we ignore the data that the world has 21 million refugees, out of which 5.5 are Palestinian refugees. The more recent refugees, as we know them, are just about 21 million. That's 1/10 of the total international migrants. So 9 out of 10 migrants, international migrants, are economic or voluntary migrants. That's an important fact to remember. When it is economic and voluntary, means that somebody is looking for a job, somebody else is recruiting them, which means it must be win-win. Otherwise, this contract would not last. So that is a fact that is missing from the picture, whether it is legal or illegal. And then another data relating to the US. The square kilometer, the surface area of the United States is 10 million square kilometers. That's about the same, maybe a little higher than the sum total of land areas of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So there is a lot of space. Yes, it is true that the share of population of immigrants in the population in the US or in the high income OECD countries has gone from roughly under 10% about the year 2000 to about just below 14% now. Okay, so that's the question. How high is too high? Is that too high? And then you look at, should we say, United Arab Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, 94%. That's the population of immigrants or foreign workers in the UAE. So how high is too high? So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Let's open it up for discussion here. Fast-moving hand over here. And again, for those that are joining us by webcast, those of you in the room, please raise the hand. That's a good old tried and tested method. For those outside the room, however, tweeting questions at Migration Policy using the hashtag MPIDiscuss or emailing us at events@migrationpolicy.org. And please go ahead and identify yourself and dive in.
Good afternoon. This is Sonia Plaza, also co-founder of Nomad from the World Bank Migration and Remittances team. I have a question. I'm really fascinated. I have to buy the book now. But when you mentioned very nicely the woman asking about the religion, how God we can be continuing poor, I think that I would like to know your views how religion, the Catholic religion, play in the life of Rosalie and the whole family.
I wish I had. There's a picture on my website of the shrine in Rosalie's house,
Yes.
which has more Our Ladies of this and that than I can count. And the first thing she did when she got her new house was she stenciled this giant cross on the wall, 6 feet tall, with letters that you say, "Blessed, He is blessed in my faith," and Lord of Lords and King of Kings. So I would say her faith is rather central to her life.
Because whatever you describe in the story, when I was listening, you're describing the story of any other Latin America being grown up as a Catholic, okay? Where you as a woman, and that's why I like your introduction on the gender angle that you have been. As a woman, you cannot ask questions. When you come here to the United States, you ask all the questions of the world because you are completely liberated. You're supposed to be very obedient. Oh yes, you have to tell all the truth to your parents. So this is the kind of thing. So that's I wanted to see how this played, and if
I see.
If the Catholic assimilation, because they're Catholic, so the assimilation was easier than, for example, people from Mindanao that are Muslims will have been easier.
The gender relations, so there's 20 nurses that come together, mostly Filipino, some from the Caribbean. 19 of them were women, and most of the times they were bringing men, husbands, with them who were experiencing some sort of downward economic move. The women got the jobs, the men had to follow. So they went to work at Whataburger, or Chris, Rosalie's husband, got a job in the city wastewater plant. So the guys took these blue-collar jobs, and the women were making 2, 3, 4 times as much money as them. This was totally unanticipated to me, but this played out with a lot of tension in a lot of different ways. So some men drank, some men had affairs, some men got abusive. In Rosalie's case, Chris, his version of a man cave were rooster farms. He went off and started going to cock raising farms out in the country and importing roosters back to the Philippines. As Rosalie said, he's crazy for chickens.
As habits go, that's a better one.
Yeah, it wasn't a simple. At one level, it's a story of female empowerment because the women become exactly. the breadwinners. But it wasn't a simple story of female empowerment because they really went out of their way to try not to let the men feel diminished and demeaned. So in Rosalie's case, it was always this complicated yoga move. On the one hand, she was moving forward with her professional progress. On the other hand, she was kind of leaning back and trying to make sure that Chris felt included. So when they bought the house, she took out the mortgage in her name but put his name on the deed to make sure that he felt it was his house as well.
Hi, my name is Dana Lee. I'm the Director of Community Outreach with the local refugee resettlement agency, the Lutheran Social Services. My comment and question come off of what Dilip last said about space. And that last passage, Andrew, that you read just very significantly hit me with what I'm thinking about during this conversation about what is the right way to control migration. Is there a right way? Low skilled, high skilled, which countries do we ban and not ban? My question has to do with refugee resettlement. We control where these immigrants are coming to. Where is going to have good housing prices, good jobs? Where do we have a refugee resettlement site set up? So we can control where in this space they go. Often with higher skilled labor, you're going to an area that you've been sponsored by a visa, a work visa. And that is likely going to be in areas where you have larger corporations and ideal city spaces in the United States. But how do we get immigrants to fill these locations that are less known but need that lower skilled labor as well? I come from Kentucky, and there's a lot of low skilled jobs that are filled by immigrants that the local population just can't and will not do. And so what are your opinions on a level of control in, okay, if we're going to have a more open system, well, let's control where people go? I don't even know how I feel on it, but I'm definitely interested in your all's opinions.
You want to?
Policy question. Go to the
Yeah, I
policy
think-
now.
Well, if you go back to my original point, managing people is not that simple. So we have seen through the Bracero program or even the current guest worker program, the agricultural visa program in the U.S. Also, there was a piece, I think in New York Times or Washington Post yesterday or day before yesterday about sugarcane industry in the U.S. and the exploitation of workers. And then the story of the guest workers from Turkey and Germany. And so, whenever you have controls about placing them, about duration, about profession, about wages, they don't work. They lead to all sorts of exploitation. And if we are not we don't care about exploitation and some moral standards of the 21st century, then all options are available. Otherwise, the options are limited, and they ought to be more incentive compatible with human incentives, both on the employer side as well as the worker's point of view. And I want to mention one thing here, and this is not to steal away from your book, but is you kind of hint at it. Actually, it is there in the book throughout, how workers are underpaid everywhere. What is not highlighted enough in the book, and it should be highlighted in the future, because you picked a great, Jason, you picked a great profession for your book. Is a nurse, and for that there is a readily available visa. In fact, the green card is waiting for the person. Whereas for a lot of workers, there isn't a proper legal pathway. So either they have to resort to smuggling and coyotes and all that in corridors where there are no legal pathways, or in other corridors where there is a legal pathway, but the number of visas available is lower than the demand. There are very high recruitment fees that are charged illegally by labor agents. And those recruitment fees can be 2, 3, 4 years of a person's expected income in the country where they are going to work. And there is a Sustainable Development Goal indicator now, 10.7.1, to reduce recruitment costs for such migrant workers. Kind of related questions.
Yeah, prompted a thought. When I first got to know Rosalie's situation, I thought, poor Rosalie, she has to go abroad. She has to go overseas to work. The more I got to know her, the more I realized it was lucky Rosalie, she gets to go abroad. So there's a whole class of people, the poorest people don't get to migrate. It takes money. There's broker fees. You have to get medical checkups. You have to have connections. So there's a whole world of migrants poorer than Rosalie, who wished they had the chances to go abroad that she and her family had.
I would just add to this too. I mean, just to echo something Dilip said earlier. I mean, you can try and say, I mean, as you'll hear people say sometimes, we get to decide who comes into this country. Government attempts to manage migration, however, if they don't take into account supply and demand, something my colleague Doris Meisner says, are doomed to fail. I mean, it's not that governments are powerless. Government policy, policies do have some influence, certainly over who gets visas, how easy it is to come in, where you can cross the border to some extent. But they're not all powerful, right? And to some extent, you've got to actually, policies have to be consonant with the law of supply and demand, otherwise unlikely to be able to re-engineer the world. It's a little bit like trying to re-engineer the tides, right? You can do it to a point. Like we do actually know how to, we can dam areas, we know how to do this, but only up to a point. Right? There's a question that came in over the transom, which is to say in one of our virtual systems from Wilfredo Tungol, Affirmative Action Officer at Hawaii State Department of Health. Great, you could join us from Hawaii. That's fabulous, from Honolulu. Wish we were with you, by the way. What is your opinion? You as a room of envious people thinking about where you are. What is your opinion of the Trump administration trying to change the family unification policy under the INA of 1965 to a merit-based policy? So what do you think of merit? What's been called merit-based immigration policy? More work-based.
I don't have strong views or strong knowledge. I see a case for bringing in people with skills. I see a case for bringing in relatives. I'm kind of sentimentally drawn to the idea of huddled masses, not huddled engineers. But I don't think I bring anything new to that discussion.
Dylan, you want to dive in?
I think I know of a country which was having. I know of a country which was trying to, it was in the throes of crisis, financial crisis, economic crisis, and it was trying to recruit or invest in technology and get up the value-added ladder, so to say, to modernize the economy, develop more. And it couldn't attract the right kind of people, because if you only allow the person to come but not the spouse, or you don't allow the spouse to work, a lot of people, good people, will not come. Then you get the wrong kind of people. So the beautiful thing about the story that you have, Jason, in this book, and I really loved the last chapter where you talk about. The chapter is called Complete. Mm-hmm. And Rosalie waits 4 years before she goes back home from Galveston, right? And she was waiting for that moment when everybody is home, the children are home for the first time with the husband. Husband has found a job, and she has some money, so she would go back home. And that sense of completeness, that she's going home, the other home. And then she says in the last line, actually the home is here. So she comes back. That story of completion you would never have if the family is not unified. So you will get the wrong kind of people, and there'll be abuse and all sorts of distortions also that would come with it. And again, there is a point, which family member is useless? The mother, father, son, sister, who is useless? I mean, how can you say any individual is useless today, and how can you gauge that that person is not going to be a Nobel laureate or the founder of IBM in 20, 30 years' time?
I was going to turn into a discussion of public charge here. Okay, we have time for about 5 more minutes. Let's take a question here, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, my name is Renu Nath. I'm a senior researcher at Mercy Corps. So I actually would love to ask you this question, and Dilip, please chime in if you want to. But one thing that I am constantly kind of facing is what else, and I'd love to hear from Rosalie's experiences, what else can NGOs and INGOs do in order to better facilitate and discuss the migration experience, both for the migrants themselves as well as for the sending and the receiving countries? How can we better integrate these conversations for all of these three groups of people that or things that are involved?
When you started asking that question, it occurred to me that Rosalie really didn't have much contact with anything like agency of assimilation. I would say the hospital was her and one reason why I think the U.S. has historically integrated immigrants more successfully than Europe is because it has higher employment rates. So it was the same for Chris too. Dilip alluded cryptically to a story about Chris where he's listening. His best friend at work was African American, Chris Filipino. They're in the truck and a rap song comes on with some lyrics, and Chris doesn't quite get the nuances. And so Chris has learned to be an American by driving around with listening to rap music, and Rosalie's learning to be an American by treating the wide variety of ethnicities and economic levels that come through a hospital. I would say that's what touched them, and maybe secondarily the church, but there wasn't much of a ethnic organization or anything like that.
And the school system for the kids.
And the schools for the kids.
I think NGOs, civil society should be there to support them and, reach out to them. That's all I would say. That would help a lot in terms of reaching out.
By no means didn't mean to suggest that what they do is unimportant, just that her quirky situation, she didn't intersect much with it.
Just one of the realities of the United States. We actually do relatively little in terms of integration. Not to say that, we do more with refugees, we do more with certain populations, but many immigrants never go through anything that would be sort of a formal integration program. Yet we have pretty good outcomes, actually. It's quite extraordinary. So there was a hand up here, and any other hands, we'll take them now as our clock ticks down. So.
Hi, I cannot wait to read your book, Jason, and I love the discussion on it. I'm Barbara Spann from Western Union, and I have a question on, great to see you again, Andrew. And I have a question on the impact of on decision-making from the spectrum of data versus emotion. 10 years ago this year, Western Union launched a ranking of countries that were receiving immigrants, 61 countries, ranking them on their receptivity, on their need, demand, need for job fulfillment. And all of you up there were involved in some way 10 years ago this year. Dilip was on part of the peer review panel, your predecessor here at MPI. Dimitri was also part of that peer review panel. Woodrow Wilson Center is where we launched the research. Jason, you've written on it, or at least used it in some other research. And the intent of that data-driven research on the need and receptivity was to better inform decision-making by governments and others who were enabling immigrants to come or not or filling jobs. Well, about halfway between then and now, started hearing folks raise the question, should we really be producing more data? Because frankly, nobody's listening to the data. They aren't using it to inform their decision-making in the political realm or others. I've heard you mention the political realm today, Jason. Dilip, you mentioned the emotional realm. At Western Union, I know I have sat and had tears also over some stories, and I found joy in stories. So my question to you is, do you think that decision-making today over immigration and immigrant jobs and settlement here is blind to the data that's been produced and really is more about the emotional story, for better or worse? And where do you think the impact lies?
Before you answer that, are there any other questions before the clock is ticking down? Speak now, forever hold your peace. Wrong context? Okay. Go ahead, Jason.
Wow. As a storyteller, I guess I'm inclined to say that stories matter and have a more lasting impact than statistics. But I started out by saying that The eureka moment for me was one of Dilip's statistics about the importance of migration. I try in telling the migration story to marry narrative and data, but your question is really about how does that get translated in the policy context, and I think it's probably worth having a humble effect of humble expectation of how your work gets translated into policy context. I mean, you certainly hope it builds understanding and empathy, but it doesn't always.
My guess is your TED Talk has probably gotten more listeners and more views than anything you've ever written. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an order of magnitude, a talk like this, you would be happy if you get, let's say, 3,000 views.
Wow, 3,000.
I think it would be difficult to get to that. And most of my other talks, maybe 1,200, 1,300. Some of the blogs have gone to maybe 40,000 or something. Blogs, 600 words or something. But you're right, TED Talk had a lot of viewership and impact, I think. And if I can just add to Barb's point, that statistic on remittances prompted, as you say, you to follow this with some more intensity, I suppose, to this whole story. I think that to me, as a data person, I really want to also know the emotional part of it, the case study versus the overall literature survey kind of mapping of the literature. You need the broad brush conclusions to be drawn from the literature and big data analysis, and then you need the case study, which is what you have here. It's with all its nuances, and without the story and the emotional side of it, the data would not strike a chord. The TED Talk did because of the emotional aspect of it. I had to lay bare everything about myself. At some point you feel naked, but that is what is needed. So that is one thing that you need both data as well as the story. And I hope that you would go to the next stage of the second generation, what happens to the family. I really hope that. So please continue at it. But I want to also say that the data on remittances had major impact in terms of policy making. For example, on brain drain, we don't hear the word brain drain so much. You actually begin to hear more brain gain these days. And I think that was the flip happened because of the discovery of the size of remittances. Now, if I point out that, okay, you have 1 million people crossing the border in Europe, into Europe per year, the US maybe 1 million, maybe less now. Globally, how many million do you think? It's actually 4 or 5 million people that migrate every year permanently. There are 10 million more temporary migration, but 5 million out of a population of 7.4 billion, right? Then I tell you that actually I am expecting migrant stock to double or triple in 10 years' time. Then if you are thinking about building a wall can keep maybe a few hundred or a few thousand people out. Can it keep 1 million people out? Can it keep 10 million people out? You go and attack the smuggling boats or whatever. Those are band-aid solutions. If you have a tsunami coming, a simple dam or a wall is not going to stop. So what we need now is proper forward-looking migration profiles. And MPI has done wonderful things. I hope that you'll continue to get into that, keeping in mind some forward-looking views and tell the countries, hey, you are building this policy, you are making this policy to aiming at managing maybe 500,000 people or 5,000 people. Actually, what you need is much bigger than that. That would open up eyes, and that might actually change the policy. If you put things as a climate change is going to displace 143 million people. That's what the World Bank report said a year ago. If that number is correct, you better wake up to it now. So I think data is key. if presented properly.
And I'd say this book took you 7 years to write? I mean,
That's generous.
generous, right? But much of what you were doing was constructing the narrative, but what you were doing was also mining the data. One of the things that is beautiful about this book is he gently tucks the data within the narrative, much like you do in the TED Talk, right? I mean, so it's the narrative that that people remember, but you couldn't do this without the data, right? You couldn't do this without the analysis. And that's a little bit that's a little bit the reality. One thing is how you make the story real and how you capture the nuances, right, which are hard to do behind data. But at the same time, you do need the data to actually tell the story as well, right? They're each telling each other, a piece of each other. Any final remarks, Jason, before we conclude?
Thank you.
Final word.
Thank you.
I want to thank Michelle and Lisa for organizing this, and Sarah as well. Thank you, and all my colleagues at MPI that actually have at some point also participated with Jason in talking about this book, and really honored to have you here presenting the book. We wish you the best. Highly recommend it. There are copies for sale out there. Dilip, thank you for everything you've done, as well as being the germ of the idea behind this book, being the switch for the light bulb that went off in Jason's head. And we look forward to continued discussion with many of you here in the future. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.